They call it the true blood instinct. They say a wolf knows its sovereign by the scent of his fur and the resonance of his growl. But Kaelen? He reeked of rot. He wore his brother's stolen furs like a shroud, and every time he opened his mouth, the air in the courtyard grew thick with the stench of his lies. For 3 winters, I was the pulse of this pack. I mapped the mountain passes, I hunted the winter herds, and I kept the elders fed while the throne sat empty. I played the part of the obedient tracker. I kept my head down. I stayed in the shadows. I let them believe I was just another pair of hands. That was my mistake. Silence isn't just lack of speech. It is a consent to tyranny. Kaelen sits on that throne now, his fingers trembling on the hilt of a sword he doesn't have the stomach to wield. He thinks he owns me because he owns the walls of this keep.
He thinks that by stripping me of my rank, he strips me of my power.
He looks at me and sees a woman who can be broken, a trophy to silence the whispers of the dying pack. He expects me to bare my throat. He expects me to accept the mark of a coward. He has no idea what happens when you corner a wolf that has forgotten how to fear. Today, I don't just walk away from the throne. I tear down the foundation he's built his lies upon. The wind is rising, the snow is turning into a shroud, and I am finally, blissfully, done being afraid. Hello, my beautiful listeners, and welcome back to Zoya's Collections. Before we dive into today's chapter, I just want to take a quick moment to say how incredibly grateful I am for this amazing community we are building together. We have listeners tuning in from all over the world, and I absolutely love seeing our pack grow. So, before the story begins, I have a quick question for you. What territory are you listening from today? Head down to the comment section right now and drop your city or country below. I try to read every single one, and I love seeing how far our pack travels. All right, grab your headphones, get comfortable, and let's step into the story. Chapter 1. The courtyard of the High Keep was dead silent. Hundreds of my packmates stood on the frozen cobblestones. I could hear their rapid heartbeats. I could smell their sour, sharp panic. Kaelen paced at the top of the grand hall steps. The scent rolling off him wasn't the rich, deep pine of a true leader. It was the rancid stink of deceit. The winter will be brutal, Kaelen projected. His voice cracked slightly, bouncing off the towering stone walls. My brother fell to the gorge. The pack needs stability. He stopped pacing and locked his pale eyes on me. Submit to me, Alara, he said. Take my mark. Marry me. Guide the hunters, and I will ensure you never go hungry. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered shifters. The elders shifted on their feet. Kaelen was desperate. He needed my reputation as the lead tracker to keep the pack from rioting. It was a calculated political trap. If I agreed, I validated his rule. The logical, safe choice was to lower my eyes, to accept the arrangement, stay warm by the massive hearths, and bide my time. But the biological fire in my chest roared against it. My wolf clawed at my ribs. I refused to let this weak, entitled male chain me to his side. I took a deliberate step forward. I didn't shrink. I didn't bare my neck. I am the lead tracker of this pack, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the freezing wind. I feed these people. I read the snow. I do not submit to a coward who smells of his brother's blood. The silence shattered. Kaelen's face flushed a violent, blotchy red. His pale eyes widened in pure, unadulterated rage. Treason! Kaelen shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. You dare disrespect me? You are stripped of your rank. You are stripped of your name. He stormed down the first 3 stone steps, his chest heaving. Throw her out. Banish her to the Blackwood Ridge. Let the blizzard have her. No one moved to grab me. The hunters I had trained simply stared at the ground. They were too afraid to fight him, but too ashamed to lay a hand on me. I can walk out myself, I said. I turned my back on the usurper. I marched toward the heavy iron-wrought gates of the keep. The bitter wind howled, biting at my exposed cheeks. I pushed through the massive wooden doors and stepped out into the blinding white of the oncoming storm. The heavy gates slammed shut behind me with a deafening boom. I was completely alone. No food, no shelter, just the clothes on my back and the freezing wilderness ahead. The biting cold immediately began to seep through my leather boots. I took a deep breath. I let my enhanced senses expand into the tree line to find a path, but instead of the crisp scent of pine and snow, the wind carried something else: warmth, heavy, overwhelming biological heat, and the thick, coppery scent of fresh blood belonging to a massive, feral predator waiting in the snowdrift just ahead. Chapter 2. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. I pulled my thin cloak tighter, but the fabric was useless against the teeth of the Blackwood Ridge. Every step was a battle against the drifts that clawed at my knees, trying to pull me down into the white sleep. But I kept moving. My muscles burned with sheer determination, and my senses were pushed to the absolute edge. I wasn't just walking, I was hunting for a grave. I followed that heavy, coppery scent of blood through the shifting powder. It was thick, metallic, and undeniable. It smelled like the very foundation of the pack. I pushed through a dense thicket of pines, the branches whipping my face, and then I saw him. He was a mountain of black fur and matted crimson. He lay in a hollow beneath a gnarled oak, his massive frame barely rising with each ragged, wet breath. He wasn't a monster. He was a wolf, natural and beautiful, but severely broken. The ice was crusted over his flanks, and the snow around him was stained a deep, ugly rust. I knelt beside him. The scent of him was overwhelming: damp earth, pine needles, and the deep, masculine musk of a true alpha. It was a scent that made my own skin prickle with an intense biological pull. He was dying. My pack's true sovereign was bleeding out in the dirt while the usurper sat on his throne. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I brushed the matted fur near his throat. He didn't growl. He didn't move. He was past the point of instinct. "You aren't dying here," I whispered. I dug my hands into the frozen ground and began to clear the snow, creating a makeshift sled from heavy pine boughs. It was brutal work. My hands went numb, and the cold seeped into my marrow, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I hoisted his heavy, dead weight onto the boughs, using every ounce of my shifter strength. Every time I tugged the sled, his body shifted, and a low, guttural vibration rumbled in his chest, a sound that was almost a moan of pain. It tore through me. I pulled him through the woods for hours, my lungs burning, my vision blurring. Finally, I reached the mouth of the small, stone-walled den I had built weeks ago. I dragged him inside. The change in temperature hit me like a physical blow. I had a small stockpile of dry wood and furs. I moved with frantic, shaky energy, stripping away his matted fur and checking the wounds. They were deep. As I washed the blood away with snowmelt, he suddenly lashed out. His massive, clawed paw caught my wrist, pinning me to the floor. His eyes weren't open, but his teeth were bared, a warning rumble shaking the room. He was trapped in a nightmare, his feral mind fighting a battle I couldn't see. I didn't pull away. I leaned into his space, pressing my palm against his bare chest. I could feel his heart hammering, a wild, irregular rhythm. I had to anchor him before his own biology killed him. I let my inner wolf rise, letting my body heat spike, radiating warmth directly into his cooling skin. He groaned, the sound raw and broken. His grip on my wrist tightened, but his claws retracted. He shifted, his massive side pressing flush against mine, desperately seeking the heat I was offering. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, pressed against him, until his heavy, rhythmic breathing finally began to slow. I was exhausted, drained, and terrified of what tomorrow would bring. I closed my eyes for just a second, letting my guard down, when a sharp, unnatural snap of wood echoed from outside the den. He went rigid, his eyes snapped open, not blue, not brown, but a glowing, feral silver that pierced the darkness of the room. Chapter 3. The silver in his eyes wasn't human. It was pure predatory instinct. He didn't know who I was, or where he was. He only knew he was in a den with a stranger. His muscles bunched, preparing to launch. "Easy," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. I'm not a threat. He let out a sound, a cross between a heavy sniff and a snarl, that made the hairs on my arms stand up. His body was a furnace, radiating so much heat that I could smell his singed fur. He was still in the throes of the fever, his brain caught between the wolf and the man. He lunged, not to attack, but to scramble backward, hitting the stone wall with a thud that shook the entire structure. He was trying to protect himself, but he was too weak. His legs buckled, and he collapsed, panting. He looked at me, his gaze unfocused, his breathing wet and ragged. I didn't move. I kept my palms raised, showing him I carried nothing. I watched the way his chest heaved, the way his muscles quivered under his skin. He was the most beautiful, terrifying thing I had ever seen. The pack bond between us felt like a taut wire stretched between our hearts. He tilted his head, a confused sigh escaping him. He tried to stand again, but his limbs failed him. He let out a desperate, pained whine that sounded more human than wolf. It broke my heart. "I'm going to get you warmer," I said, moving slowly toward the fire. He watched me with that intense, glowing gaze. When I moved to grab more wood, he tracked my every motion. He was like a trapped animal, hyper-aware and hyper-vigilant. I added more logs to the fire, the flames licking at the dry wood until the room was bright. He hated the light. He flinched, his eyes squeezing shut. The fever was frying his brain. If I didn't break it now, he wouldn't survive the night. I walked over to him, kneeling close enough to feel the radiating waves of his heat. "I need you to let me help you," he growled, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. But he didn't move to stop me. I laid my hands on his shoulders. His skin was burning to the touch. I closed my eyes and reached deep, calling upon my own biological reserves, forcing my own heat to bleed into him. It was an intimate, intrusive act. It felt like standing bare in a winter storm. I stripped away my heavy outer cloak, needing as little barrier between us as possible. I crawled into the furs beside him. He was huge. His frame was easily twice mine. When I pressed my side against his, the contrast was jarring. He was all heat and hard muscle. I was cold and trembling. The moment our skin touched, he went perfectly still. His breathing hitched. He turned his head, his nose brushing against my neck, inhaling deeply. He let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. He shifted closer, his massive arm moving with agonizing slowness, until it was draped over my waist, pinning me to his side. He wasn't letting go. He needed this heat, this contact, as much as he needed air. I lay there, trapped in the grip of the most dangerous man in the woods, my heart racing. I was exhausted, yet I couldn't sleep. His heartbeat was syncing with mine, a slow, deep thud that echoed in my own chest. I fell into a fitful, shallow sleep. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up to a heavy weight on top of me. The fire had died down to embers. Aldric had shifted. In his sleep, his biology had forced a partial transformation. He was no longer a wolf, but a man, massive, scarred, and completely bare, sprawled over me, his face buried in the crook of my neck. He was muttering in his sleep, his voice a deep, gravelly rasp. I tried to slide out from under him, but his grip tightened. He let out a possessive, territorial rumble that felt like a command. Then his hand moved. His fingers tangled into my hair, and he pulled me even closer, his lips brushing my skin with an affection that felt accidental yet intentional. My pulse skyrocketed. He was coming back, but his mind wasn't whole, and in his current state, I was the only thing standing between him and the void. He pulled me up until I was flush against his chest, his eyes suddenly snapping open in the dark. Chapter 4. He was staring at me. The darkness in the den was thick, but the fading embers of the fire cast just enough light to see those silver eyes. They weren't looking at me like a threat anymore. They were looking at me like I was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to mist. "Aldric?" I whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He opened his mouth, his jaw working as if he were trying to find the shape of a word that had been erased from his memory. He looked frustrated. a raw, primal anger that manifested in the way his knuckles went white against my shoulder. He shifted his weight, his knee coming between my legs, trapping me completely. It was an accidental dominance, a reflex born of his alpha nature. My own wolf reacted, a surge of fierce pride rising to meet him. I didn't recoil, I didn't push. I held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. He leaned in, his nose pressing to my temple, searching for something. His scent was changing. The rot of the river and the metallic tang of blood were fading, replaced by the deep, earthy richness of the mountain pines. It was a scent that triggered a visceral, physical pull deep in my own gut. He started to move, his hand sliding down my spine in a slow, deliberate touch that made my breath catch. He was mapping me. He was learning the shape of me, the warmth of me, the heartbeat under my skin. He was an alpha in every sense of the word, and even with his mind shattered, his instinct to protect and possess was the only thing left. I reached out, placing a hand on his chest. His skin was still fever-hot, but the erratic pulse had settled into a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. "You're safe," I whispered, my voice sounding shaky even to my own ears. He let out a low, vibrating hum, his eyes fluttering shut for a heartbeat, before snapping open again. He suddenly sat up, bringing me with him, and pulled me into his lap. He was massive, his broad shoulders blocking out the rest of the den. He held me there, his face buried in my neck, his breathing ragged and deep. He was grounding himself. He wasn't speaking, but he was communicating with every touch. He was asking for more. He was demanding I stay. It was a silent, desperate pact. I wrapped my arms around his neck, feeling the thick, corded muscles of his shoulders. I was risking everything by being here with him, but the choice had been made the second I saw him in the snow. He suddenly stood, sweeping me up into his arms as if I weighed nothing. I gasped, my hands flying to his shoulders to balance myself. He carried me toward the back of the den, toward the sleeping furs, his stride long and purposeful. He didn't look at anything but me. He set me down gently, then sank to his knees in front of me, his eyes searching mine with desperate confusion. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, his touch light as a feather. He was trying to figure out who I was, and why he felt like he would tear the world apart if I ever left his sight. I felt a surge of elation that was almost dizzying. This was the true alpha, the man who had been my sovereign before he was lost. And here he was, at my feet, stripped of his crown, his memory, and his pride, looking at me as if I were the only light in his dark. I leaned forward, my forehead resting against his. He let out a shuddering breath and leaned into me, his hands finding the small of my back and pulling me flush against him. He was trembling, not with fever, but with a raw, overwhelming need. I felt his lips brush against my ear, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was finally going to speak. Then, the heavy, reinforced wooden door of the den, the one I had spent hours bracing against the storm, suddenly exploded inward with a deafening, bone-shaking crash. Chapter 5. The den was instantly filled with the freezing, howling fury of the blizzard. The heavy oak door lay splintered across the floor, a jagged casualty of the gale. I scrambled back, my heart hammering against my ribs, but Aldric was already moving. He didn't look like a broken man anymore. In the flash of lightning that illuminated the den, he was a lethal blur of corded muscle and raw, explosive power. He didn't roar. He simply surged forward, his body low to the ground, blocking me from the swirling white chaos. His scent, pine, mountain earth, and the metallic sharpness of an alpha, overpowered the biting cold. "Stay behind me!" I hissed in a frantic whisper. Though he already knew, he didn't look back. His shoulders were locked, his back a wall of solid, impenetrable protection. The storm outside was trying to claim us, but the man between me and the door was a fiercer, more primal force. He wasn't just guarding his territory, he was guarding me. Suddenly, a massive, fur-clad figure stepped through the debris. It wasn't a rogue. It was one of Kaelen's senior hunters, a man named Herrick. He held a thick wooden torch, its flame flickering violently in the wind. Herrick's eyes widened in absolute shock when he saw the massive, bare-chested sovereign standing in the center of the room. "Aldric?" Herrick gasped, his voice trembling with sheer terror. Aldric didn't give him a chance to recover. He moved with a speed that defied the physical world. He crossed the den in 2 strides, his hand shooting out to grip Herrick by the throat, hoisting the heavy man off the ground until his boots dangled inches above the stone floor. "Don't!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the stone walls. Aldric froze. He didn't release Herrick, but his head snapped toward me, his silver eyes searching my face. The pure, unadulterated confusion in his expression was devastating. He was caught between his biological instinct to eliminate the intruder and his desperate need to listen to my command. "He's a pack member, Aldric," I said, stepping into the flickering light with my hands open. "If you kill him, there is no going back. Kaelen will have his war." Aldric's knuckles turned white around Herrick's throat. The man was turning purple, his eyes bulging as he clawed at the iron grip. Aldric looked at me, then at the choking man in his grasp. The violent tension in his posture was at war with the desperate need he felt for the peace we had shared just moments ago. Slowly, with a heavy grunt of pure disgust, he hurled Herrick backward. The hunter crashed against the stone wall, the torch flying from his hand and extinguishing in the snow. Herrick scrambled to his knees, gasping frantically for air while clutching his bruised neck. He looked at Aldric with genuine, animalistic reverence. "I didn't come to fight, my sovereign," Herrick wheezed, his voice thin and broken. "I came to find the tracker. Kaelen is dying, the pack is starving. We thought you were dead." Aldric didn't answer him. He turned his broad back on the hunter, his entire focus shifting instantly to me. He stepped deeply into my space, his body looming, his heat radiating like an open hearth. He bent his head, his nose burying itself completely into the crook of my neck. He inhaled sharply, his breath hot against my skin, and let out a deep, vibrating hum that resonated through his massive chest. It was a blatant, possessive mark. He was scent-marking me in front of another pack member, claiming me as his and his alone. The intimacy of it, the raw, unapologetic honesty of the claim, made my knees go weak. "You can't take her," Aldric said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It was his first real sentence, and the dark sound of it sent a thrill of absolute triumph straight down my spine. Herrick stared at us, witnessing the ultimate shift in power. "The pack needs you both." Aldric didn't spare him a glance. He gripped my waist, his thumb digging possessively into my hip, his gaze locked on mine with a fierce need so intense it felt like a physical weight. "She stays." He turned back to the broken door, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He picked up a jagged piece of the splintered oak and jammed it back into the frame, creating a primitive but effective barricade against the world. He was choosing me. He was choosing the den. He was choosing our life over his throne. But as the wind died down, a new sound cut through the heavy silence. It wasn't the storm. It was the howl of a dozen wolves, far off in the woods, rapidly closing in on our position. Aldric's head snapped up, his ears twitching as his muscles locked into place. He hadn't just brought a hunter. He had brought a search party, and we were no longer alone. Chapter 6. The howling drew closer. It wasn't the rhythmic, disciplined call of a pack on the hunt. It was the disjointed, frantic braying of a pack that had entirely lost its way. Kaelen's loyalists were closing in. Aldric paced the small room, raw aggression rippling under his scarred skin. He was no longer the broken man I had dragged from the river. He was the sovereign, but he was a sovereign without his army. He turned to me, his chest heaving, his silver eyes flashing with a wild, fiercely protective instinct. "They come for you," he rasped, his large hand reaching out to gently trace the sharp line of my jaw. "They come for the alpha," I corrected, leaning heavily into the burning heat of his palm. I could smell the ozone radiating off him, the metallic scent of a storm about to break. My own inner wolf was pacing, restless, and ready to draw blood. "They think you're still weak," Aldric let out a short, sharp, humorless sound that was more of a bark than a laugh. He looked at Herrick, who was still cowering in the corner of the den. "You, go out there. Tell them I am dead. Tell them the gorge claimed us both." Herrick shook his head frantically, his face pale and slick with sweat. "They'll smell the truth on you, Sovereign. You're alive. You're here, and you have the tracker." Aldric's jaw tightened into a hard line. He stepped toward the doorway, his imposing silhouette forming a mountain of a man against the backdrop of the swirling blizzard. He looked back at me, the lethal edge in his eyes softening instantly into absolute devotion. He walked over to the pile of furs and threw a heavy pelt over my shoulders, wrapping me tightly in a cocoon of warmth. "Hide," he commanded softly. "I am the lead tracker," I said, my voice cold and perfectly steady. "I don't hide." I walked directly toward him, ignoring the frantic terror gnawing at my insides. I took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, and searingly hot. When our fingers interlaced, a shock of undeniable heat moved through me, a biological reminder of the heavy bond tying us together. The howling grew deafening. They were right outside our walls. Aldric didn't wait to be cornered. He moved to the doorway and shoved the heavy oak barricade completely aside. He stepped out into the raging blizzard, his bare chest exposed to the sub-zero temperatures. He didn't shiver. He didn't even blink. He stood there, a terrifying beacon of defiance, as the woods slowly filled with the dark silhouettes of 12 armored wolves. They froze the second they saw him. It was a tableau of absolute, stunning disbelief. There stood their rightful king, completely stripped of his armor, yet radiating a raw power that made the armed soldiers physically stumble backward in the snow. Then, one of them, a massive, heavily scarred wolf named Drax, stepped forward. He wasn't one of Kaelen's blind sycophants. He was a veteran. He looked at Aldric, then at me, his scarred face heavy with grief. "Sovereign," Drax said, his deep voice carrying over the wind. "We were sent to kill the traitor. We were told she took you. We were told she was poisoning your mind." Aldric's grip on my hand tightened until my knuckles went completely white. "She saved my life." "She is banished," Drax roared, his voice cracking with heavy, conflicted emotion. "Kaelen's law is the law of the pack. You are the sovereign, but you have been gone too long. The pack is starving, Aldric. Look at us." He gestured wildly to the other wolves. They were gaunt, their ribs visibly jutting out beneath their thin, matted winter coats. They were the direct casualties of Kaelen's selfish incompetence. My heart squeezed painfully in my chest. I had personally trained many of these men. I had taught them how to track, how to feed, how to survive. Aldric took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "Kaelen is not your sovereign. He is a thief." "He is the one who feeds us," Drax countered, his hand hovering nervously over the heavy blade at his belt. "If you will not return, then we must finish the job. Give us the tracker." The other wolves moved in, their circle tightening around us like a noose. Aldric turned slightly, his massive body shielding me completely from their line of sight. He was absolutely prepared to fight 12 of his own warriors, unarmed, in the dead center of a blizzard. I looked past his shoulder at Drax. I knew this man. I stepped out from behind Aldric's protective shadow, my head held high, refusing to break eye contact. "You think Kaelen feeds you?" I asked, my voice cutting sharply through the howling wind. "He throws bloody scraps at you while he gorges himself in the high keep. He hides behind the stone walls while you slowly die in the snow. Is that leadership, Drax? Or is it a parasite?" Drax hesitated, his hand trembling over his blade. He looked at the starving wolves flanking him, then back to my unbroken posture. The hesitation on his face was slowly replaced by a flickering of profound respect. "He's right behind you," Herrick whispered frantically from the den doorway. I spun around. Kaelen was there. He hadn't just sent the hunters to do his dirty work. He had followed them himself, his face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly hatred, his hand raised high in the air to signal the hidden archers waiting in the frozen pines. Chapter 7. The air in the clearing went completely dead. Not even the freezing wind dared to move. I looked up into the heavy pines, seeing the dark, still shadows of the hidden archers Kaelen had brought with him. They were waiting with their bows drawn tight for his signal. Kaelen stepped confidently into the center of the circle, his expensive furs flapping in the biting cold. He looked at Aldric, then at me, his lip curling in obvious disgust. "Look at you," Kaelen sneered, his voice dripping with cruel amusement. The great sovereign, brought low, living in a dirt hole with a banished tracker. Aldric didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on his brother, his posture radiating a primal, untouchable calm. He was the quiet center of the storm, and that terrifying stillness was clearly unnerving Kaelen. "She is my mate," Aldric said. The words were spoken clearly, loudly, and without a single hint of hesitation. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. The hunters, Drax included, looked at each other with wide-eyed shock. The fated mate bond was not a myth. It was the sacred cornerstone of our history. To deny it was to deny the very survival of our species. Kaelen's face went completely pale. "She is nothing. She is a traitor who abandoned her post. If you want to die with her, Sovereign, that is your choice." He raised his hand high into the air. "Kill them both!" Drax didn't move. None of the hunters moved. They were looking at Aldric, the man who had just publicly claimed a banished tracker as his fated mate, and then back at Kaelen, the usurper who was about to order the death of the true blood. "I said kill them!" Kaelen screamed, his artificial composure finally shattering. Still, absolutely no one moved. Aldric stepped forward, his eyes flashing a brilliant, predatory silver. He didn't need a weapon. He didn't need armor. He was the sovereign. He looked at Kaelen, then slowly swept his gaze up to the archers hiding in the trees. "Do you know who you serve?" Aldric's voice was low and resonant, a sound that seemed to vibrate directly in the chests of every wolf present. "You serve a man who has forgotten what it means to be a wolf. You serve a man who fears a tracker more than he fears the winter." He turned his burning gaze to the veteran hunter. "Drax, you were there when we were born. You held us in your arms. Do you serve this coward, or do you serve your blood?" Drax looked at Kaelen, his scarred face twisted with heavy grief and sudden, fierce resolve. He looked up at the archers, then dropped his gaze to the blood-stained snow. He slowly, deliberately sank to his knees. One by one, the surrounding hunters followed his lead. They didn't do it out of fear. They did it out of profound reverence. Kaelen suddenly stood entirely alone in the center of the clearing, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "Traitors!" Kaelen shrieked, scrambling backward. "I will have your heads for this." He turned to run, but Aldric was impossibly faster. He covered the distance in a single heartbeat, grabbing Kaelen by the heavy collar of his furs and slamming him violently to the frozen ground. Aldric didn't kill him. He just held him there, his massive hand pinned directly over Kaelen's racing heart. "You will not die today," Aldric whispered, his voice slicing through the air like a cold, sharp blade. "You will live to see what you have thrown away. You will live to see this pack made whole again." Aldric leaned down, his lips brushing harshly against Kaelen's ear. "And you will never look at her again." Kaelen gasped, his entire body shaking with raw terror. Aldric released his grip, stepping back and allowing the coward to scramble to his feet and vanish into the dark tree line. Aldric stood in the center of the clearing as the snow began to fall around him. He turned slowly toward me. The lethal aggression in his eyes vanished entirely, replaced by a raw, overwhelming devotion. He reached out, his large hand cupping my face, his thumb gently tracing the line of my lower lip. "Mine," he whispered softly. The fated bond snapped violently into place, a sudden, blinding rush of heat that made my knees buckle. I reached up, tangling my fingers deep into his dark hair, pulling him down to me. The entire world around us, the kneeling hunters, the archers, the bitter snow, completely faded away. There was only the scorching heat of his skin, the scent of the winter pines, and the knowledge that we were finally, undeniably, home. But the profound moment of peace was brutally short-lived. From the direction of the high keep, a horn sounded. A long, deep, mournful note that signaled an absolute emergency. Drax stood up abruptly, his face pale as death. "Sovereign," Drax said, his voice urgent and trembling. "The keep, it is burning." Chapter 8. The smoke rose in a thick, choking black plume against the starlit sky, entirely visible even from the dense woods of the Blackwood Ridge. The keep was the very heart of our history, the sacred place where our ancestors had carved our survival into the stone of the mountain. Seeing it ablaze felt like watching a vital part of myself wither away into ash. Aldric went completely rigid, his hand tightening on my waist until it almost bruised my skin. His glowing eyes were fixed on the plume of smoke. His nostrils flared wildly as he caught the scent of burning wood, and, beneath it, the unmistakable, sickening smell of a deliberate, chemical fire. "Drax," Aldric said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying growl. "Who is at the keep?" "Only the elders, Sovereign," Drax replied, his thick voice trembling. "And the children." A collective gasp rippled through the group of seasoned hunters. My own heart stopped dead in my chest. The children were our entire future. If Kaelen had truly set fire to the keep, he wasn't just trying to win a throne. He was intentionally burning down the pack's legacy to ensure there was absolutely nothing left for us to inherit. Aldric turned to me, his silver eyes searching my face with desperate, clawing panic. He needed me to lead. He needed me to tell him what to do. But his biology was screaming at him to keep his mate safe. "I am going," I said, my voice perfectly steady, the fierce determination a solid weight in my chest. Aldric didn't argue. He didn't try to coddle me or protect me from the flames. He simply took my hand, his crushing grip incredibly reassuring, his touch a silent promise. We go together. We moved as one. The trek back to the keep was a blur of frantic adrenaline and terror. We ran through the deep snow, the hunters falling in behind us in a silent, highly disciplined formation. We reached the iron gates of the keep within the hour. The main hall was completely engulfed in flames. The heat was blistering, and the sound of the burning wood roared like 1,000 starving beasts. I could hear the frantic, helpless cries of the elders trapped in the courtyard, but the children— there was absolutely no sound coming from the nursery wing. "The nursery!" I shouted, violently breaking away from Aldric's protective grip. "Elara, no!" Aldric roared over the flames, but I was already moving. I dove straight through the blazing side entrance of the keep. The air was thick with black smoke that immediately burned my eyes and scorched the inside of my lungs. I didn't think about the lethal fire, or the crumbling stone walls, or the death that waited in the oppressive heat. I only thought about the little ones. Their faces, their innocent laughter, their stolen future. I reached the nursery wing to find the heavy wooden doors hanging off their melted hinges. The room was rapidly filling with smoke, the massive oak ceiling already beginning to loudly buckle under the strain. I moved through the chaos on pure instinct, gathering the frightened, weeping children, my shifter senses pushed to their absolute breaking point. Suddenly, I heard a massive collapse, the entire roof of the main hall falling in. The explosive force of the blast sent a physical wave of searing heat rushing through the hallway, knocking me hard to my knees. I scrambled frantically back to my feet, the children clinging desperately to my heavy cloak, their sobs sharp and stabbing in my ears. I turned to exit, but a massive, flaming beam had fallen, completely blocking our only path. The smoke was too thick, the heat too intense to push through. We were entirely trapped. I looked down at the children. Their eyes were wide with sheer terror, their small, soot-covered hands clutched tightly in my own. I wasn't going to let them die in the dark. I absolutely refused. Suddenly, I heard Aldric's roar from the other side of the wall. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated, world-ending fury. He was coming for us. I could hear the terrible sound of solid stone being physically torn apart, the roar of the fire actually being pushed back by a biological force that completely defied logic. He burst through the blazing debris, his scarred face blackened by soot. his glowing eyes blazing with a determination that was almost divine. He saw me, he saw the huddled children, and for a single heartbeat, he stopped. He looked at me, truly looked at me, with a profound awe that stole the remaining breath from my lungs. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply scooped up the children in his massive, muscular arms, then grabbed me, his large hand locking securely onto my waist. We moved rapidly through the flames, the blistering heat literally parting before his massive frame, the very air seeming to bow to his absolute command. We cleared the burning threshold and collapsed together onto the cold, snowy ground of the outer courtyard. The freezing night air felt like a benediction from the gods. I took a deep, shuddering breath of the crisp, clean oxygen, the relief so profound I thought I might actually faint. Aldric stood over us, his broad chest heaving, his powerful body a map of fresh scorch marks and sweat. He looked at the burning keep, then at the safe children, and finally down at me. He looked at me as if I were the only living miracle in a world that had entirely forgotten how to believe. He slowly dropped to his knees. His massive, imposing frame bowed deeply, his head lowering toward the bloody snow. He bared his thick neck to me, the ultimate, irreversible act of biological submission, of absolute, unwavering devotion to his mate, to his Luna. The hardened hunters, the weeping elders, the entire surviving pack. They all watched in a silence so profound it felt like the world had entirely stopped turning. They watched as the true blood, the supreme sovereign of the Silver Pines, willingly knelt before the woman he had banished, the fierce tracker who had saved him, the woman who was finally, undeniably, his entire heart. But as I reached out my trembling hand to touch his bowed head, the sacred silence was brutally shattered by a single, high-pitched scream from the dark tree line. Kaelen was back, and he hadn't come alone. He had brought the rogues. Chapter 9. The scream ripped through the cooling night air like a jagged blade, cutting completely through the exhaustion that had been dragging at my bones. Kaelen's voice. It wasn't the sound of a man coming to negotiate. It was the sound of a man who had finally lost the very last shred of his sanity. He emerged from the dark tree line, not alone, but backed by a thick wall of shifting shadows. The rogues. They were hulking, heavily scarred figures, smelling of stagnant water and old, festering hatred. The kind of wolves who had entirely forgotten what it meant to belong to a pack. Aldric didn't just stand. He surged. The sudden transition was terrifying. 1 second he was a man kneeling in absolute devotion, and the next, he was a lethal, coiled spring of alpha fury. He didn't even look back at me. He didn't have to. His massive body moved with the singular, terrifying purpose of a protector who had decided the world would burn to ash before he let a single hair on my head be harmed. "Get them behind the stone wall," Aldric rasped, his voice sounding like heavy, grinding gravel. I didn't argue. I grabbed the smallest child tightly by the hand, urgently motioning to the frail elders to scramble toward the inner courtyard's remaining stone fortifications. My pulse was a frantic, high-pitched rhythm against my ribs. I glanced back just once. Aldric was standing entirely alone in the center of the courtyard, his broad shoulders squared, his large hands balled into bone-crushing fists. He looked like an impenetrable monolith of dark stone against the orange glow of the dying fire. Kaelen stepped fully into the light, his face a bruised, swollen mask of pure disgust. He wasn't wearing his stolen furs anymore. He was stripped down to a torn leather tunic, and he carried a heavy, iron-bound staff, the cruel symbol of the usurper. He looked at Aldric with a sickening, wide-eyed amusement. "You think you've won, brother?" Kaelen's voice echoed, hitting the stone walls with a hollow, taunting resonance. "You think a few bowed heads and a burnt-out shell of a nursery makes you a king? Look around you. Your pack is starving, your throne is ash, and your little tracker? She's the exact reason you're a fool." Aldric didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the soot-covered snow. "I am not a king, Kaelen," Aldric declared, his voice vibrating with lethal authority. "I am the blood of this land, and you? You are a cancer that I am finally going to excise." The rogues began to circle. They moved with a predatory, loping gait, their eyes glowing with a feral, unnatural hunger. I pushed the last of the weeping children into the safety of the cellar, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grasp the heavy iron latch. I felt a surge of fierce determination so sharp it made my vision blur. I couldn't just hide. I couldn't just stand by while he faced an entire pack of killers alone. I turned back to the courtyard. The night air was thick with the scent of ozone and impending violence. Aldric was in the middle of a literal whirlwind. He moved faster than any wolf I had ever seen, his body a lethal blur of speed and brutal precision. He didn't use teeth or claws. He used his heavy weight, his momentum, and the sheer, overwhelming mass of his alpha biology. He threw one rogue into the stone pillar with a sickening thud, then ducked smoothly under the wild swing of another, planting a massive fist into the creature's gut, with enough force to lift him entirely off his feet. It was a display of physical dominance that bordered on the divine. But Kaelen wasn't watching the fight. He was watching me. Our eyes locked across the courtyard. Kaelen's bruised face twisted into a cruel, triumphant sneer. He knew exactly where the leverage was. He knew that Aldric's strength, his focus, and his very soul were tied directly to the woman standing in the cellar doorway. Kaelen didn't go for Aldric. He went for the shadows. He moved with a snake-like, treacherous grace, slipping completely through the periphery of the chaotic fray. I realized his dark intention, a single heartbeat too late. My breath hitched in a sharp, painful gasp. He wasn't trying to win the fight. He was trying to violently shatter the bond. "Aldric!" I screamed, my voice tearing my throat. Aldric's head snapped toward me, his glowing silver eyes dilating in sheer, primal panic. He saw Kaelen's shadow looming right behind me. He saw the heavy iron staff raised high into the air. In that split second, the entire world seemed to slow to a crawl. Aldric threw himself toward me, abandoning the attacking rogues, abandoning his own defense, abandoning his own life, just to reach the space where I stood. But he was too far. Kaelen brought the heavy staff down. It wasn't aimed at my head. It was aimed squarely at my shoulder, a crushing, bone-snapping blow meant to permanently cripple. The impact was explosive. Pain, white-hot and utterly blinding, detonated through my entire nervous system. I hit the frozen ground hard, the breath violently driven out of my lungs in a desperate, wheezing gasp. Everything went black at the edges of my vision. I heard a roar, not from a man, not from a wolf, but from something that sounded like the mountains themselves rending completely apart. Aldric arrived like a thunderbolt. He didn't just strike Kaelen, he collided with him, a massive weight of pure, unbridled fury. The sheer force of the impact was so catastrophic that Kaelen was flung backward through the heavy oak debris, his broken body tumbling violently across the courtyard until he disappeared into the darkness of the ruined hall. Aldric was at my side in a nanosecond. He was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps, his large hands hovering over me, terrified to touch the bleeding wound, terrified to break me any further. His eyes were wide, frantically scanning my body for damage, his nostrils flaring wildly as he caught the metallic scent of my spilled blood. "Alara," he rasped, his deep voice trembling with a raw, agonizing desperation. "Look at me. Please, look at me." I couldn't. The blinding pain was too immense. I felt the world dangerously tilting, the cold snow biting into my cheek. The overwhelming warmth of his massive presence was the only thing tethering me to reality. I reached out blindly, my trembling fingers finding the solid, burning heat of his chest. I felt his heartbeat. It was frantic, wild, like a trapped bird fluttering desperately against his ribs. I'm here," I managed to whisper, the words thin and incredibly brittle. Aldric didn't wait for me to recover. He swept me up into his strong arms, his touch surprisingly gentle, almost reverent despite the chaos. He didn't care about the rogues who were regrouping. He didn't care about the pack watching in stunned silence. He didn't care about the dying fire. He turned his broad back on the keep and carried me straight toward the dense woods of the Blackwood Ridge, his stride long and completely unrelenting. He didn't take me to the infirmary. He didn't take me to the remaining elders. He took me directly to the sanctuary of our hidden stone den. "You are mine," he growled fiercely, the heavy words vibrating through his chest and directly into my own. "You are the blood in my veins. You are the air in my lungs. You will not leave me. Do you hear me? You will not leave me." His absolute intensity was overwhelming. It was the raw, unpolished devotion of a sovereign who had finally found his center and was now fully prepared to slaughter the entire world to keep it safe. As he ran through the heavy trees, the bond between us began to practically glow, a literal, physical sensation of heat that seemed to seep from the marrow of his bones straight into mine. It was a searing connection that utterly defied logic. The surviving rogues were following us. I could hear them. The sharp snap of winter twigs, the low, wet growls of pursuit. They were relentless. But Aldric didn't slow down. Every heavy step he took was a defiance of his own trauma. He was running toward a future he hadn't dared to imagine until I had pulled him out of the snow. We reached the hidden entrance to the den. He ducked smoothly inside, laying me incredibly gently on the soft furs. The small stone room was still blessedly warm from the fire we had stoked hours earlier. He knelt over my broken body, his scarred face a vivid map of absolute grief and a longing so deep it looked like physical agony. He pressed his large, warm hand directly over the bleeding wound on my shoulder. The dark, rich blood was already soaking into the furs. He didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly bowed his head until his brow pressed heavily against mine. "I was entirely empty," he whispered, his voice a low, broken hum in the quiet room. "I was a shell. I was just waiting for the freezing river to take me. And then I smelled you." He looked up, his silver eyes glowing with a fierce determination that made my own wolf howl in response. He leaned in, his warm lips brushing softly against my forehead, my cheek, my jaw. It was a slow, deliberate worship. "The pack is lost without you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. "But I am dead without you." Outside, the heavy thud of the rogues arrived. I heard them hit the thick oak door. They didn't hammer, they clawed. They threw their heavy bodies violently against the wood, the entire den shaking with the force of their assault. Aldric didn't turn around. He didn't even spare a glance at the door. He kept his glowing eyes locked entirely on me, his hand tracing the delicate line of my collarbone, his touch light, possessive, and terrifyingly intense. "Let them come," he murmured, a dark, lethal promise. He began to shift. It wasn't the ragged, forced transformation from the river. It was a fluid, seamless expansion of his biology. His broad shoulders widened, his skin rippling with the shifting of heavy muscle and bone, his sharp features transforming into the terrifying, magnificent visage of the apex wolf. But he didn't leave my side. He crouched directly over me, his massive, fur-covered frame forming a living, breathing shield. He looked at the splintering door, then back down at me. The heavy wood finally gave way. One of the rogues, a massive beast with a missing ear, pushed his way violently through the opening, his sharp teeth bared, his eyes wide with desperate rage. He lunged straight for us. Aldric didn't move until the very last possible second. He simply opened his massive jaw, a cavern of lethal white teeth and focused determination, and met the rogue in midair. The sound was wet, crunching, and incredibly sudden. The heavy rogue hit the stone wall and slid down, entirely lifeless. But there were more coming. Aldric stood firmly over me, his dark hackles raised high, his tail stiff, his entire existence compressed into the singular, violent act of protecting his mate. The fated bond between us flared, a blinding, white-hot surge of energy that made my head spin. I reached out my good arm, my hand sinking deeply into the thick, coarse fur of his neck. "Aldric," I breathed, my voice barely audible over the snarling of the remaining rogues outside. He turned his massive head, his silver eyes softening for a single, beautiful heartbeat. In that heavy silence, amidst the absolute chaos, Amidst the immediate threat of death, I finally felt it. The snapping of my final restraint. The deep realization that the lonely life I had before was gone forever. He turned back to the remaining rogues, his deep growl so powerful it literally rattled the foundations of the den. It was a sound of absolute, unquestionable ownership. But then, the final figure stepped forward into the doorway. It wasn't a rogue wolf. It was Kaelen. Kaelen wasn't holding his staff anymore. He was holding a small glass vial, a clear, highly volatile liquid that smelled intensely of bitter, caustic chemicals. He stepped into the den, his bruised face a twisted mask of desperate, pathetic hatred. "If I can't have her," Kaelen hissed, his hand shaking violently, "then absolutely no one will." He threw the glass vial. It didn't hit Aldric. It didn't hit me. It hit the burning embers of the hearth. The explosion was catastrophic and immediate. The fire, fed by the volatile chemical, roared violently to life, creating a towering inferno of blue and white flame that instantly engulfed the entire back wall of the den. The stone ceiling, already heavily weakened by the previous storm, groaned terribly and then buckled inward. Aldric screamed, a sound of raw, unadulterated agony, as he lunged desperately to pull me away. But the heavy stone debris fell far too fast. The world, the blistering heat, the scent of his mate, and the glowing silver eyes of the only man I had ever loved, it all disappeared in a crushing, suffocating rush of collapsing stone and flame. I felt the solid ground physically open up beneath us, revealing a hidden passage, a forgotten tunnel, a terrifying darkness that swallowed us entirely whole. The absolute last thing I heard was Aldric's voice, a desperate, heart-shattering echo fading into the pitch black. "Ilara!" And then, there was only the crushing silence of the earth. Will Aldric's raw, unbreakable devotion be enough to pull Ilara from the crushing darkness? Or has the usurper's chemical fire buried their fated bond forever? The brutal fight for survival was only the beginning. Now, the ultimate emotional reckoning and the deeply romantic claiming of the true Luna is finally at hand. To experience the exact moment the massive alpha completely unleashes his absolute, terrifying power to protect the female who saved him, you need to be here for part 2. Subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications right now so you do not miss a single breathless second of the conclusion. The Sovereign's revenge is coming, and their unbreakable bond is about to ignite.